Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Today we are going to explain another case of two kids who murdered their parents. Stick till the end to know what actually happened. They were young, rich, and living the kind of life many could only dream of. Lyle and Erik Menendez were the sons of José and Mary Louise Kitty Menendez. José was a Cuban immigrant who built his fortune through hard work and determination, rising to executive positions at companies like RCA and eventually becoming the CEO of Live Entertainment. Kitty, a former teacher, gave up her career to raise their two sons. In 1986, the family moved into a $5 million Mediterranean-style mansion at 722 North Elm Drive in Beverly Hills, California. To outsiders, they had it all: money, status, and a beautiful home. But on the night of August 20th, 1989, everything changed. Lyle and Erik entered their home with two 12-gauge shotguns. They shot their parents in the family room as they watched television. José was shot in the head and killed instantly. Kitty was shot several times, including a shot to the face that nearly obliterated her features. The scene was so horrific that police initially theorized a professional hit due to its brutality. Lyle called 911 at 11:47 p.m., sobbing as he told the operator, "Somebody killed my parents." When police arrived, they found the brothers crying on the lawn. At first, they were not considered suspects. Investigators entertained the idea of a mob hit or business-related retaliation. Considering José's high profile in the entertainment industry, there were no signs of forced entry, and the family's valuables were untouched. Over the next few months, the brothers' behavior raised suspicions. Rather than retreat into mourning, Lyle and Erik spent large amounts of money from their inheritance. They bought luxury cars, designer clothing, tennis lessons, and even invested in a restaurant. Investigators began to question the nature of their grief. Despite being advised by their attorney not to leave the area, Lyle returned to Princeton University, while Erik participated in tennis tournaments. The turning point came in October 1989, when Erik confessed to his psychologist, Dr. Jerome Aziel. Erik reportedly felt guilt and anxiety and disclosed the murders during therapy. Dr. Aziel recorded the confession. His mistress, Judalon Smythe, later alerted police out of fear that Erik might kill Aziel. Police obtained the tapes, and after a lengthy legal battle over therapist-patient confidentiality, the California Supreme Court ruled the tapes admissible. Because Erik had confessed to committing a crime and threatened the therapist, on March 8, 1990, Lyle was arrested in Beverly Hills. Erik, who had fled to Israel, turned himself in a few days later upon learning of Lyle's arrest. The brothers were charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. They were held without bail. Their trial began in 1993 in Los Angeles County Superior Court with Judge Stanley Weisberg presiding. The defense, led by attorney Leslie Abramson, did not dispute that the brothers committed the murders. Instead, they argued that the killings were an act of self-defense after years of sexual, physical, and emotional abuse by their father, José, and psychological neglect by their mother, Kitty. The defense presented testimony from both brothers, who claimed they had been molested by their father since early childhood. Erik testified that the abuse began when he was 6 years old. The defense also presented letters and witnesses to support claims of dysfunction in the household. One piece of evidence cited was a letter Erik had written to his cousin Andy Cano in 1988, describing alleged sexual abuse. The cousin had not shared it until years later, and it resurfaced as part of later petitions for reconsideration. The prosecution, led by Pamela Bosnich and Lester Kuriyama, presented a different narrative. The brothers killed out of greed. They cited the premeditated nature of the murders, the use of shotguns purchased out of town to avoid suspicion, and the shopping spree that followed. The prosecution pointed out that the brothers fired multiple shots and even reloaded during the attack. They noted that José had been hit in the back of the head from close range, and that Kitty had been chased down the hallway and shot repeatedly, undermining the self-defense narrative. The trial was broadcast on Court TV and captivated the nation. The jury heard from over 60 witnesses and saw graphic crime scene photos. The emotional testimony, especially from Erik, was a focus of media attention. The trial ended in early 1994 with two deadlocked juries. Neither could agree on whether the killings were murder or manslaughter. Judge Weisberg declared a mistrial. In 1995, the retrial began. This time, the judge ruled that the proceedings would not be televised and placed limits on the admissibility of the abuse allegations. Abramson again argued that the brothers acted out of fear. The prosecution emphasized the evidence pointing to planning and financial motive. This time, the jury was not swayed. On March 20, 1996, both brothers were found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. In July 1996, they were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. They were originally housed at separate prisons, but in April 2018, after nearly 22 years apart, they were reunited at the R.J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego County. In the years following their conviction, the Menendez brothers maintained their claims of abuse. In 2017, ABC aired a two-night documentary special titled Truth and Lies. The Menendez brothers and NBC aired a drama series, Law and Order, True Crime, The Menendez Murders. In 2021, a TikTok trend emerged among younger audiences, revisiting trial footage and generating support for the brothers, some arguing that their allegations of abuse warranted leniency. That same year, new evidence came to light in the form of a letter Erik wrote to a cousin in 1988 that referenced possible abuse. The letter reignited discussions about whether their trial had adequately considered the claims. In 2023, Netflix released a docuseries titled Monsters, The Menendez Brothers, further reviving public interest in the case. That same year, new court filings were made citing statements from several former classmates who claimed Erik had confided in them about abuse during their teenage years. As of 2024, Lyle and Erik Menendez remain incarcerated at R.J. Donovan. There are no pending appeals, but their legal team has submitted a request for reconsideration under California's revised sentencing laws, which allow for parole reviews for offenders who were under 26 at the time of their crimes. Advocates argue that while the murders were undeniably horrific, they occurred in a context that wasn't fully appreciated by the legal system of the time. Some legal analysts have noted that if the case were tried in the 2020s with current understandings of trauma, abuse, and mental health, the verdicts might have been different. Regardless of where one stands, the Menendez case remains a haunting example of how deep-seated family dysfunction, untreated trauma, and wealth can converge with fatal consequences. It continues to provoke questions about what justice truly means in cases that defy simple explanations. The documents, court transcripts, testimonies, psychological evaluations, and confession tapes remain publicly accessible and provide one of the most comprehensive views into a murder case in American legal history. The documents, court transcripts, testimonies, psychological evaluations, and confession tapes remain publicly accessible and provide one of the most comprehensive views into a murder case in American legal history. This extensive archive of material allows researchers, legal analysts, and the general public to dissect the Menendez case in a level of detail rarely available in other criminal trials. The initial police investigation, for instance, revealed inconsistencies early on, but due to the brothers' emotional demeanor and the brutality of the crime, detectives hesitated to focus on them as suspects. Instead, investigators explored avenues involving José's business dealings, including theories about a professional hit or organized crime connections. These leads turned up no concrete evidence, and it wasn't until behavioral patterns and forensic details began to align with internal family dynamics that the suspicion narrowed in on the brothers. Lyle and Erik's lavish spending drew the attention of both the media and authorities, with estimates suggesting they spent nearly $700,000 in the months following the murders. They purchased Rolex watches, high-end clothes, and even opened a business, all of which contrasted sharply with their supposed grief. Surveillance and interviews began to focus more directly on their whereabouts, their purchases, and their relationships with others in their inner circle. In parallel, forensic evidence indicated that the shotguns had been purchased out of town in San Diego, and Lyle's use of a fake name at the gun store was later confirmed. Investigators were also struck by how the brothers seemed disconnected from the trauma. They showed no hesitation in remodeling parts of the house or discarding their parents' belongings. At the same time, Dr. Jerome Oziel's therapy sessions with Erik became the key breakthrough in the case. In those sessions, Erik reportedly described the night of the murders in chilling detail, stating that both he and Lyle had plotted and executed the crime together. Oziel recorded these confessions secretly, fearing for his safety after Erik allegedly threatened him. These tapes became the centerpiece of the pre-trial motions and ultimately played a critical role in the prosecution's case. The defense's strategy under attorney Leslie Abramson was to humanize the brothers and explain their actions through the lens of long-term abuse. They brought in psychological experts who testified about the effects of childhood sexual trauma and how fear responses could be distorted in abusive environments. Erik and Lyle both testified in vivid detail about their father's alleged acts of molestation and their mother's neglect and complicity. Letters from Erik to his cousin hinted at something being seriously wrong within the household. Some family friends and former nannies also recalled incidents where Kitty appeared sedated or where José's controlling behavior was evident. However, these testimonies did not constitute direct evidence, and critics argued that they were too subjective to justify the killings. The prosecution countered this with cold, hard facts: premeditated gun purchases, shells found on the scene, maps traced in their belongings showing escape routes, and calculated financial decisions made days after the murders. They emphasized the timeline and the brutal nature of the attack. José was shot in the back of the head at close range, and Kitty was shot so many times that her body was described as nearly unrecognizable. During the first trial, the jury was visibly affected by the brothers' testimony. They cried on the stand, showed remorse, and detailed a childhood filled with trauma. The nation was divided. Some believed the brothers were victims themselves, while others saw their actions as inexcusable. The trial ended in a mistrial due to a hung jury. The retrial, however, stripped away any elements of the abuse narrative. Judge Weisberg ruled that certain testimonies and psychological evaluations could not be admitted the second time, without the ability to paint the full picture of their upbringing. The defense struggled. Prosecutors focused entirely on motive and method. They presented a timeline that showed the brothers had meticulously planned the crime. They had practiced at shooting ranges, scoped out the best times to enter the home, and even removed the shotgun's serial numbers to avoid detection. The jury in the second trial found both Lyle and Erik guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy. In 1996, they were sentenced to life without parole. In the years following, numerous documentaries, interviews, and books have dissected the trial. Some focused on the legal technicalities, others on the sociological implications of abuse and wealth. A recurring theme has been whether the justice system adequately considered the full context in which the murders occurred. Notably, legal scholars have argued that the 1990s had limited understanding of trauma and its psychological impact. Mental health assessments were not as developed or accepted in courts as they are now, expert witnesses on trauma were often dismissed as speculative, despite clinical evidence suggesting otherwise. New details have continued to emerge. In 2018, Lyle and Erik were reunited in prison. They had spent more than 2 decades in separate facilities. Their emotional reunion sparked another wave of public interest, especially among younger generations who had discovered the case through online platforms. That same year, advocates submitted new letters and statements from individuals who claimed Erik had confided in them about abuse during his teenage years. These documents were not available during the trial. In 2021, viral TikTok clips showed the brothers testifying and crying on the stand, reigniting discussions about trauma and justice. Supporters launched online petitions asking for re-evaluation. Under California's newer laws related to youth offenders and trauma-informed sentencing, legal experts debated the implications. Could new laws or mounting public pressure influence a case as high-profile and historic as the Menendez trial? By 2023, the Menendez brothers' legal team had formally filed a petition for a resentencing hearing, citing changes in California law that allowed for reconsideration of life sentences for individuals under the age of 26 at the time of their crimes, especially if trauma or abuse was involved. The filing included new statements from classmates, therapists, and extended family. Though no ruling had been made by 2024, the ongoing conversation suggested the case was far from closed in the public's eyes. In addition to the legal dimensions, the Menendez brothers' story has been the subject of extensive media dramatization. Shows like Law and Order, True Crime, and Netflix's Monsters portrayed the emotional complexities of the case, giving audiences a look into what may have been a deeply dysfunctional household. Critics, however, cautioned against romanticizing the story. They warned that emotional storytelling, while compelling, should not override the severity of the crimes committed. Despite remaining incarcerated, both Lyle and Erik have participated in educational programs, maintained communication with advocates, and expressed ongoing remorse for their actions. In prison interviews, both have spoken about their regret, not only for the act itself, but for not finding another way to address what they claimed was unbearable family abuse. They acknowledged the irreversible nature of their actions and said they hoped to contribute positively to prison communities. Their correspondence and statements have often been shared publicly, especially by support groups advocating for their reconsideration. Still, the legal community remains divided. Some believe the original verdict was just and final. Others see the brothers as products of a home that failed them in every conceivable way. They argue that the legal system of the 1990s was not equipped to handle the psychological intricacies that might have altered the course of the trial had they been tried today. Forensic psychologists and trauma experts have since conducted retrospective analyses of the case. Many suggest that the indicators of prolonged abuse were present but poorly understood at the time. They point to documented patterns of behavior consistent with complex PTSD and fear-based decision-making. However, none of this changes the fact that 2 people were brutally murdered in what prosecutors still describe as a calculated act for financial gain. The details of the crime remain staggering in their brutality. José was shot point-blank in the back of the head with a 12-gauge shotgun, and Kitty was shot a total of 10 times, chased through the room, and finished off with a blast to the face. The autopsy reports painted a vivid picture of the violence and rage in the attack, showing how calculated it had been despite the brothers' claims of acting out of fear. Even with the introduction of psychological and trauma experts in later years, legal scholars consistently emphasize that the method of execution was indicative of deliberation. It was not a sudden act of panic, but an organized plan involving the purchase of weapons, the disposal of evidence, and the detailed follow-up behavior, cleaning the crime scene, creating alibis, and manipulating friends and acquaintances. In the days that followed, after the murders, Lyle and Erik quickly resumed their lives, buying luxury watches, sports cars, and even investing in businesses. They stayed in upscale hotels and spent money freely, using credit cards and trust fund access that they secured through their parents' estate. This post-murder behavior became a central part of the prosecution's narrative. Prosecutors introduced receipts, bank records, and testimony from employees at high-end retailers to show just how quickly and aggressively the brothers accessed wealth following the murders. They argued that this was not the behavior of two traumatized young men reacting in fear, but of two individuals driven by greed and opportunism. Even supporters of the brothers found it difficult to reconcile this extravagant behavior with their claims of victimization. Erik's tennis coach and close friend testified during trial about changes in Erik's demeanor after the murders. He appeared more confident, more relaxed, and less emotionally inhibited, suggesting a sense of release rather than remorse. Psychological experts introduced during the trials and later in appeals maintained that trauma could manifest in contradictory ways. They stated that the dissociative effects of long-term abuse could cause erratic and irrational behavior, especially when triggered by a perception of extreme threat. Defense experts cited studies of abused children who commit parricide, often under conditions where they feel that escape or protection is impossible. In Erik and Lyle's case, their defense maintained that José was planning to cut them off financially and separate them, triggering their fear that the abuse would intensify or become public. This argument remained highly controversial. Prosecutors dismissed it, arguing there was no immediate threat the night of the murders. Kitty was in her nightgown, watching television. José was unarmed and unaware. There was no confrontation, no fight, no visible trigger that night, just execution. Further complicating the narrative were tapes of Erik's confessions to Dr. Jerome Azil, which included details of how the brothers discussed alibis, practiced at shooting ranges, and mapped out how to avoid detection. These tapes, once admitted as evidence, gave prosecutors the ammunition to show clear intent. In the recordings, Erik detailed how they planned to purchase the shotguns out of town and remove the serial numbers. He talked about how they had waited for the right opportunity and discussed what to do if they were caught. These details proved instrumental at establishing premeditation. However, as public interest in the case surged again in the 2020s, new analyses revisited the mental health elements. Modern trauma psychologists re-evaluated the available records and testimony and highlighted that long-term incestuous abuse and emotional neglect could lead to hypervigilance and catastrophic fear responses. They suggested that if the brothers truly believed that they were in danger of being killed or exposed by their father, the decision to kill, however reprehensible, could be seen as the culmination of years of manipulation and terror. But this remains speculative on a legal context. The core facts, the acquisition of weapons, the strategic planning, and the lack of immediate threat continue to weigh heavily against any self-defense claim in the eyes of most courts. Lyle and Erik's own statements since their conviction have shown a complex mix of regret and justification. In interviews conducted from prison, both have said that they wish they had sought help or tried to escape rather than resort to murder. Yet, they also continue to insist that their father's abuse created a psychological prison from which they felt no exit. Advocates for the brothers, including a number of psychologists, legal scholars, and members of the public, have argued that the American justice system of the 1990s was not equipped to handle the nuances of trauma-informed legal defense. They note that courts at the time viewed parricide largely as acts of rebellion or greed rather than as responses to prolonged abuse. While the term battered child syndrome had been introduced in legal circles, its application was still narrow and lacked consistent standards for diagnosis or legal relevance. In prison, both brothers have lived largely quiet lives. Erik became involved in educational programs and mental health counseling groups, while Lyle has participated in mentorship programs for younger inmates. Both have expressed remorse during parole consideration interviews, though as of now, they are ineligible for parole due to the nature of their sentences. The push for resentencing under California's newer youth offender and trauma legislation remains ongoing. Lawyers and advocates are compiling updated psychological profiles and newly submitted statements from individuals who say they were aware of the brothers' fear and suffering prior to the murders. Among them are friends from high school, former family associates, and even some correctional officers who have observed their behavior over the decades. These efforts seek not to absolve them of guilt, but to argue for a re-evaluation of their punishment in light of factors that were minimized or excluded during trial. As the debate continues, the Menendez case has become a focal point in discussions about how the justice system handles claims of abuse, particularly in affluent or high-profile families. It highlights the difficulty in proving emotional or psychological abuse, which often leaves no physical evidence, but can be deeply damaging. The brothers' case sits at the intersection of wealth, trauma, and violence, forcing the public and the legal community to wrestle with questions that lack easy answers. How do we balance accountability with compassion? When does a motive rooted in fear override a motive rooted in gain? Can someone be both a victim and a perpetrator? These are the questions that the Menendez case continues to provoke, even decades after the murders. What is clear is that the Menendez case is no longer just a story about a murder in Beverly Hills. It has evolved into a case study on how society grapples with trauma, power, and justice. It continues to challenge legal norms, ethical standards, and media portrayals, and it reminds us, painfully and powerfully, that some truths do not fit neatly into courtroom testimonies or verdicts. They emerge over time, shaped by changing science, evolving social norms, and the willingness to ask hard questions even when the answers remain elusive. The story of Lyle and Erik Menendez is not about finding one absolute truth. It is about examining all the truths that existed in their home, in their trauma, in their guilt, and in their survival. Whether the justice system ever fully accounts for all of it remains to be seen. But the world keeps watching. And perhaps that's where change begins, with awareness, conversation, and reflection. If this story gripped you, if it made you think, if it made you question the system, or simply made you want to learn more, don't let it stop here. Like this video. Share it with someone who needs to understand the weight behind this case. And make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss another breakdown of the cases that shake the world. Your support helps us bring real stories like this one into the light, and filtered, unsensationalized, and always based in truth.